courtroom has been open in heaven since 1844, and the defendant isn't who you think it is. Today, we're cracking open one of the most debated chapters in all of Scripture, Daniel 7 and the doctrine known as the Investigative Judgment. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what Daniel actually saw in that vision, why Seventh-day Adventists believe a pre-Advent judgment began in 1844, and, maybe most surprisingly, what all of this reveals about the character of God as a just judge. I've got someone here who has gone deep into the scholarship on this, and I want to start with a question that I think a lot of people have. Why does any of this matter?
It matters because Daniel 7 is not just a weird dream about monsters. According to conservative biblical scholars like Walvoord, it provides what they call the most comprehensive and detailed prophecy of future events to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. That's a bold claim, but when you actually sit with the chapter, you start to see why.
Okay, so let's actually ground people in what Daniel 7 is, because I think a lot of listeners have heard of it, but maybe haven't read it closely.
Right, so the chapter opens with Daniel having a vision. 4 massive beasts rising out of a churning sea. A lion, a bear, a leopard, and then this terrifying 4th beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. And then, out of those 10 horns, a smaller horn rises up and starts speaking arrogantly.
That's already a lot. And this is the same territory as Daniel 2, right? The 4 kingdoms?
Exactly, and here's where it gets really interesting. The commentary critical and explanatory on the whole Bible makes this point that in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar sees those same 4 world empires as a dazzling, glorious human statue. But in chapter 7, Daniel sees those exact same kingdoms as beasts, as animals. Same kingdoms, completely different moral verdict.
Wait, so it's like the world sees power as impressive and human, but God sees it as animalistic?
That's precisely it. The commentary puts it this way: Daniel sees man spiritually degraded to the beast level, led by blind impulses through his alienation from God. The animal, for all its sagacity, looks always to the ground, no consciousness of relation to God. And that's what these kingdoms represent.
That's a striking image. So chapter 7 is essentially God's moral commentary on human history.
Exactly. And scholars like Goldingay have pointed out that chapter 7 is actually the structural hinge of the entire book of Daniel. The book forms a chiasm, a literary mirror structure, and chapter 7 sits right at the center of it. It's not just one vision among many, it's the theological core of the whole book.
I did not know that. So it's like the keystone of the arch.
Great way to put it. And then the vision shifts dramatically. After all the chaos of the beasts, Daniel sees thrones being set in place, and the Ancient of Days takes his seat. His garment is white as snow, his hair like pure wool, his throne like a fiery flame. Thousands upon thousands are attending him. And then the court convenes, and the books are opened.
The books are opened. That phrase carries a lot of weight.
It does. And then, in verses 13 and 14, someone described as one like a son of man comes with the clouds of heaven and approaches the Ancient of Days. And he's given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, an everlasting kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's Daniel 7, 9 through 14, and it's the scene that everything else in the chapter hinges on.
And Jesus explicitly identifies himself with that Son of Man figure, right?
He does. According to Bible Hub's analysis of Daniel 7:22, Jesus self-identifies with the Son of Man of Daniel 7, 13 and 14 in Mark 14, 61 and 62. So this isn't just an Old Testament curiosity, it's woven directly into the New Testament understanding of who Jesus is.
Okay, so we've got the vision. Now let's get into the doctrine that grew out of it, the Investigative Judgment, because this is where things get genuinely controversial.
Yeah, and I want to be upfront. This is described by the Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia as one of the Church's most misunderstood doctrines, one that has been the subject of much scrutiny, severe criticism, dynamic defense, and continued affirmation. So we're not in settled territory here.
Fair enough. So what is the Investigative Judgment, in plain terms?
At its core, it's the Seventh-day Adventist teaching that a divine judgment of professed Christians has been in progress since 1844. Wikipedia describes it as a unique SDA doctrine, and Ellen G. White, one of the Church's founders, called it one of the pillars of Adventist belief.
1844. Where does that date come from?
It comes from Daniel 8, 13 and 14, which mentions 2,300 days. Adventists apply the day-year principle and calculate that those 2,300 prophetic days point to 1844 as the moment when Christ moved from the holy place to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary. And that movement, they argue, initiated the judgment scene described in Daniel 7, 9, and 10.
So the heavenly sanctuary is a real place in this framework, not just a metaphor.
Right. Adventists ground this in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, which they read as teaching that the two-compartment earthly sanctuary Moses built was modeled after a real heavenly sanctuary. The Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16 becomes a type, a foreshadowing of what Christ does in heaven.
Okay, and what actually happens in this judgment? Like what is being investigated?
This is where it gets really theologically rich. According to Marvin Moore's work, reviewed by the Biblical Research Institute, the investigative judgment is not for God to decide who is worthy. He already knows that before the books are opened. The purpose, Moore argues, is to let the angels see the grounds for God's decisions regarding each of his people.
Wait, so God isn't the one who needs convincing?
Exactly. The audience for the judgment is the universe, angels, and unfallen beings. The SDA Encyclopedia puts it this way: the investigative judgment is a crucial part in portraying God as the just judge who reveals the divine evaluation of all the vast evidence of world history before angels and intelligent unfallen beings. The end result is that God is, quote, proved right when he judges.
So it's less about catching humans out and more about God being transparent with the cosmos.
That's a really clean way to frame it, and it connects directly to Daniel 7:22, which Bible Hub analyzes in detail. The text says the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. The Aramaic word for judgment there is din, a formal legal decree from a superior court. It's not vague or arbitrary, it's legally grounded, public, and final.
And the judgment goes in favor of the saints. That's not what most people picture when they hear the word judgment. Right, and Bible Hub breaks down 3 dimensions of divine justice in that verse. First, retributive, the arrogant little horn is slain and its body destroyed. Second, vindicatory, judgment shifts history from persecution to possession for the saints. And third, restorative, the saints share universal dominion forever and ever. It's a complete reversal of the oppression that came before.
That's actually a hopeful picture, not a terrifying one.
And that's the point the Adventist framework is trying to make.
The SDA Encyclopedia frames it this way: just judgment entails there is first an open, transparent investigation before full exoneration or execution takes place. God doesn't just act, he shows his work.
I want to bring in something that I found genuinely surprising in the research, this 2025 paper from the Pan-African Journal of Theology, because it reframes the whole thing in a way I hadn't seen before.
Oh, the Poniatowski paper. Yeah, that one is worth sitting with. Felix Poniatowski from Adventist University of Africa argues that the Son of Man in Daniel 7 functions like a debt guarantor in ancient Near Eastern legal practice. In that legal system, a surety steps in and assumes responsibility for someone else's debt or guilt.
So Jesus isn't just a witness in the courtroom, he's the one who steps up and says, I'll cover this.
Exactly. Poniatowski concludes that Jesus assumes responsibility for the guilt of the saints of the Most High, making him the primary focus of the judgment, not the saints themselves. The saints are involved because of their union with Jesus, but the spotlight is on him as the guarantor.
That's a significant reframe, because one of the main criticisms of the investigative judgment is that it undermines assurance of salvation. Like, how can you be sure you're saved if there's still an ongoing investigation?
And that's exactly the criticism the paper is trying to address. The Pan-African Journal of Theology article notes that critics, including some within Adventism, have argued the doctrine undermines foundational biblical teachings on salvation, atonement, and assurance. Scholars like A.F. Ballinger, D. Ford, and R. Cottrell have pushed back on it from inside the church.
So this isn't a settled debate even among Adventists?
Not at all. But the Poniatowski framework offers a response. If Jesus is the guarantor, then the judgment isn't about whether you've been good enough. It's about whether you're in union with the one who has already assumed your debt. That shifts the whole emotional weight of the doctrine.
Let's talk about how this doctrine actually developed historically, because the origin story is kind of wild.
It really is. Most people associate it with Hiram Edson's famous moment in a cornfield the morning after the Great Disappointment of October 22, 1844, when William Miller's predicted return of Christ didn't happen. But according to Adventist Today's historical analysis by Glenn Hansen, Edson's cornfield vision didn't actually mention the investigative judgment at all.
Wait, seriously? The most famous moment in the doctrine's origin story didn't even include the doctrine?
Right. Edson saw that Jesus had, quote, a work to perform in the most holy place, but he wasn't sure what it was. He and O.R.L. Crozier developed the idea that Jesus had entered the most holy place, and Crozier published it in a Millerite paper called the Day Star. But the investigative judgment as a doctrine came later.
So who actually put the pieces together?
According to Hanson's research, a minister named Elon Everts was the one who began fleshing out the idea. He published a communication in the January 1, 1857 issue of the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, working from 1 Peter 4, 5, and 6. He reasoned that since Scripture speaks of a judgment of both the living and the dead, Jesus must have been judging the dead of the ages since 1844, and that this judgment had to happen before Christ's return.
And James and Ellen White were involved in those early conversations too.
They were. Hanson notes that James and Ellen White first discussed Christ's most holy place ministry with Everts during a wagon ride in Illinois in 1856. So it was a collaborative, evolving conversation, not a single revelation handed down from on high.
That's actually kind of humanizing. Theology being worked out in real time on a wagon ride.
And as early as 1841, a man named Josiah Litch had already argued that judgment could happen before Christ's second advent. He wrote that the scriptures can be harmonized on no other principle than that every man's doom is fixed before his resurrection. So the intellectual groundwork was being laid even before 1844.
So the doctrine has this long, layered history. It's not like someone just invented it out of nowhere.
Exactly. And the Adventist framework for judgment is actually quite elaborate. The SDA Encyclopedia outlines 7 distinct stages of judgment. You've got the earthly judgments in the Old Testament, the flood, Sodom, the exile, then the saving judgment of the cross, then individual judgment when someone accepts or rejects the gospel, then the pre-Advent investigative judgment, then the execution of judgment at the second coming, then a judgment of the wicked during the millennium, and finally the annihilating judgment at the end of the millennium.
7 stages. That's a whole cosmic legal system.
And the logic behind it is that just judgment requires transparency. You don't just execute, you investigate first, openly, so that everyone can see the grounds for the verdict. The SDA Encyclopedia frames it as God giving created beings time to evaluate all of fallen history in light of both his saving mercy and his moral law.
I want to go back to Daniel 7 itself for a second, because there's something in the scholarly literature that I think is worth naming. The JSTOR article by G.R. Beasley Murray points out that the 4 beasts in Daniel 7 draw on the ancient chaos monster tradition. These aren't just political symbols, they're tapping into something much older.
That's a really important point. Beasley Murray argues that the vision of the beasts is dominated by the tradition of the chaos monster of ancient myth. The idea being that these oppressive world powers aren't just historically bad, they represent a kind of cosmic anti-God force. And the judgment scene in verses 9 through 14 is the divine answer to that chaos.
So the courtroom in heaven isn't just a legal proceeding, it's the resolution of a cosmic conflict.
Exactly. And that connects to what Marvin Moore argues in his book reviewed by the Biblical Research Institute, that the investigative judgment has to be understood in the context of the great controversy, for only in that context does it make sense. Satan accuses the saints before God, pointing to their sins and claiming them as his subjects. God opens the books and lets the universe review the evidence.
So the judgment vindicates not just the saints, but God himself.
That's the core claim. The Biblical Research Institute review puts it plainly: the judgment vindicates the saints and God himself before the universe. It's not God on trial in the sense of being accused, it's God demonstrating publicly and transparently that his decisions are just.
And that brings us back to the title of this episode, Revealing the Just God. Because that's really what Daniel 7 is doing, isn't it? It's not primarily a prophecy about political empires, it's a revelation of what God is like.
That's the thread that runs through all of it. The commentary, Critical and Explanatory, makes this point. In chapter 2, the 4 kingdoms were regarded according to their external political aspect, but in chapter 7, they're revealed according to the mind of God concerning them, their moral features. God's prophet receives disclosures as to the characters of the powers of the world in a religious point of view.
So Daniel 7 is essentially God saying, here's what I actually think about what's happening on earth.
And here's what I'm going to do about it. The judgment isn't passive. Bible Hub's analysis of Daniel 7:22 notes that the Old Testament consistently links God's tzedek, his righteousness, with deliverance for the oppressed. Psalm 103:6, Isaiah 11:4 and 5. The Ancient of Days acts because his moral nature demands that wrongs be righted.
I think that's actually the most compelling part of this whole framework for a modern audience. It's not a God who watches suffering from a distance. It's a God who convenes a court.
And the verdict in that court, according to Daniel 7:22, goes in favor of the saints. The Aramaic word kadadishin, saints, refers to those set apart by God's covenant grace. They're not vindicated because they earned it. They're vindicated because the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in their favor.
Let me push back a little here, though, because critics of the investigative judgment, and there are serious ones, say this whole framework creates anxiety rather than assurance. If there's an ongoing investigation, how do you ever know you're safe?
That's the sharpest critique, and it's one the doctrine has wrestled with for a long time. The Poniatowski paper in the Pan-African Journal of Theology is specifically trying to answer it. If Jesus is the debt guarantor, the surety, then the investigation isn't about whether you've accumulated enough righteousness. It's about whether you're in union with the one who has already assumed your liability.
So the question shifts from, am I good enough, to am I connected to the one who is?
That's the reframe Poniatowski is offering. And it's significant because it addresses what critics like Walter Martin called the most bizarre and difficult to comprehend aspect of Adventism, while staying grounded in the actual text of Daniel 7 and in ancient Near Eastern legal practice.
And the Revelation 14 connection is worth naming too, because that's where the announcement goes public.
Right. Eugene Prewitt's analysis on BibleDoc.org points to Revelation 14:6 and 7, the first angel's message, which announces, "Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come." Adventists read this as the public proclamation that the investigative judgment has begun, and it's tied to the final campaign to evangelize the world before the second coming.
So the judgment and the gospel go together in this framework. They're not opposed.
That's the Adventist argument. The everlasting gospel is being preached at the same moment the judgment is announced. It's not a message of condemnation, it's a call to align with the one who is being vindicated in that heavenly courtroom.
Okay, so when you step back from all of this, the vision, the doctrine, the history, the debates, what does it actually come down to? Here's what I think is the core of it. Daniel 7 is doing something that most people don't expect from an ancient apocalyptic text. It's not just predicting the future, it's making a claim about the character of God. The beasts rise, they dominate, they oppress, and then the Ancient of Days sits down, the books are opened, and the verdict goes in favor of the oppressed. That's not a small theological point. That's a statement about what kind of universe we live in. And the investigative judgment doctrine is essentially an attempt to work out the implications of that courtroom scene for how we understand salvation, history, and God's relationship to the universe.
Exactly. Whether you land on the Adventist interpretation or not, the underlying question Daniel 7 is asking is one that every generation has to wrestle with. Is God actually just? And the vision's answer is yes, and here's the courtroom to prove it.
And the defendant in that courtroom, as Poniatowski argues, is ultimately Jesus, the Son of Man who steps forward as guarantor, takes on the liability, and receives the kingdom.
Which is why the vision ends not with destruction, but with dominion. The Son of Man is given an everlasting kingdom that shall never be destroyed. The chaos monsters lose. The court rules in favor of the saints. And God is, as the SDA Encyclopedia puts it, proved right when he judges.
That's a powerful place to land. And it circles back to where we started. A courtroom open in heaven since 1844, and the defendant isn't who you think. It turns out the one standing in the dock, taking on the weight of the case, is the Son of Man himself.
And that reframe, from a judgment that threatens to a judgment that vindicates, is what the best scholarship on Daniel 7 keeps coming back to. The vision isn't designed to make you afraid, it's designed to make you trust the judge.
So here's the takeaway for anyone sitting with this. The next time you encounter Daniel 7, whether in a sermon, a theology class, or just reading it yourself, don't just ask what the beasts represent. Ask what the courtroom scene is saying about God, because that's the question the chapter is actually answering.
And if you want to go deeper, the Pan-African Journal of Theology paper by Felix Poniatowski is genuinely worth reading. It's one of the freshest takes on this material in recent scholarship. The SDA Encyclopedia entry by Anthony McPherson is also a solid, balanced overview of the doctrine's full scope.
That's a great place to start. And with that, thanks for being here on Copilot Podcasts. A courtroom has been opened in heaven, and now you know a little more about what's actually happening inside it.